Good evening. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Kristen Gilger, and I'm the Reynolds Professor of Business Journalism here at the Cronkite School and Director of the National Center on Disability and Journalism. Thank you for being here in person. I know we have a lot of people joining us remotely this evening. Welcome to the 2022 Katherine Schneider Journalism Award for Excellence in Reporting on Disability. That's a mouthful. And the 2022 Gary Corcoran Student Prize for Excellence in Reporting on Disability. Both of these prizes are awarded by the National Center on Disability and Journalism at Cronkite, and we've been doing recognizing professional journalists' work since 2013 as a way to encourage more and better reporting in the media on disability. And this year, for the first time, we're bringing in another important group of journalists, which are student journalists, in the belief that it's the next generation of journalists who will really make the difference. I want to take just a few minutes to tell you about the two donors who make these two awards programs possible. First, there's Kathy Corcoran, who established the Corcoran Student Awards to honor the life of her brother, Gary. Kathy is an alum of the Cronkite School who came back actually last year to help in Cronkite News run our Spanish language program. And she's had a notable journalism career, including serving as chief of the AP Mexico Bureau. And she has a new book out, which is why she's not here tonight. I think she's on book tour, and I think she's going to be at Changing Hands on Wednesday night, so plug for Kathy. And we do have a word from Kathy. Chris, if we can run that video.
Hello, I'm Kathy Corcoran, and I want to extend warm congratulations to the inaugural winners of the Gary Corcoran Student Prize for Excellence in Reporting on Disability. Congratulations, Michael Garcia, Christopher Hippensteel, and Emily Schmidt. I'm sorry that a prior commitment keeps me from being with you in person tonight, but I established this award to honor my brother, Gary Corcoran, who passed away from pancreatic cancer in 2015. Gary used a wheelchair most of his life, and he was a tireless advocate for accessibility in the Phoenix area with significant public projects like the light rail, arenas, Sky Harbor Airport. And so in this way, I can combine the passions of two Corcoran siblings, his work for accessibility for all, and my passion for journalism and for journalism of the future and the young people going into the profession today. So again, congratulations.
That was Kathy, and another Kathy, our second Kathy, is Katherine Schneider, who has really been the backbone of this program, as I said, since 2013. She's a retired clinical psychologist, and the best way I can describe Katherine, I said this to a group earlier, is a force of nature. She's an educator, an author, and an advocate for people with disabilities, and has been working closely with us for over a decade now. For many years, she would join us in person for this event, but unfortunately, she couldn't make the trip this year. But we do have a statement from her, and I'd like to read it. This is from Katherine Schneider. Having grown up in the 50s and 60s and being blind from birth, I've had a lot of opportunities to encounter media portrayals of disabilities. Back then, there were few children's books with disabled characters, and mostly media coverage consisted of pitying stories about Jerry's kids and the like. I've personally experienced the coverage of something worthy I did being overshadowed and slimed with a headline like, "Blind Psychologist Overcomes Her Disability," instead of, "Blind Psychologist Publishes Fourth Book." When I retired from my career as a clinical psychologist, I decided to write 4 books and a blog, serve on too many committees and boards, and guest lecture about disability issues. I work for the full inclusion of the 1 out of 5 Americans who has a disability. One way I've done this work is with awards, first for children's books with the American Library Association, and then with the NCDJ for journalism. Awards work as shown by the multiple fine submissions those hardworking judges perused this year. My congratulations to the NCDJ, the judges, and the winners. You got it right. Special congratulations to Kathy, and by extension Gary, for starting the student journalism contest. Just think how many years those young journalists will have to write accurate, fair, and respectful stories. Forward. from Katherine Schneider. So thank you, Katherine, for those words and all you've done to improve media coverage of disability. We have a special guest tonight, Jennifer LaFleur, Senior Editor at the Center for Public Integrity and a member of the National Center on Disability and Journalism Advisory Board. Jennifer has been a contest judge for this contest multiple times in the past, but tonight she's serving in a new role as moderator for our discussion with some of the winners of the contest. And I also want to acknowledge all the winners of this year's awards, selected from among 140 entries from around the globe. And would the winners who are here tonight please take their places on stage. You might notice we have some beautiful trophies up here, and we will be giving those to the winners at the end of the night and taking pictures and congratulating them that way. So I want to announce the winners. So in the large media, in the Schneider Award, we have two categories, a large media category and a small media category. The thinking being that all the big organizations sort of were winning all of it. And this way, if you allow smaller media organizations their own honors and recognition, we can get to a lot more good work. So the first in the Schneider Award large media category goes to Heidi Blake and Katie Baker of BuzzFeed News for their story, Beyond Britney, Abuse, Exploitation, and Death Inside America's Guardianship Industry. Their examination highlighted dangerous flaws in the nation's guardianship system and the unseemly profits of those who take part of it. And the second place winner in the large media category is Sonja Sharp of the LA Times, who's here with us tonight. She, for a story called Disabled Moms Face Healthcare Snubs. Sharp, who covers education and disability rights, produced her story as a 2021 fellow with the USC Annenberg Center for Health Journalism. Third in the large media category is awarded to Joseph Shapiro and Allison Molenkamp of National Public Radio for their investigation, Air Travel Still a Nightmare for People with Disabilities, which explored the nightmares that people with disabilities face when they do air travel. The small media category winners. First place goes to journalists Karim Merhej, Karim Chehayeb, and Christina Cavalcanti, and I'm sure I butchered all those names, of the Public Source. Their story, and what would you like me to do about it? How the Lebanese government disabled hundreds of people and left them to pay for its crime, examined the failed government response and the aftermath of the devastating ammonium nitrate explosion in Beirut that left hundreds of residents disabled. Her reporting team is that reporting team is going to be on Zoom, but they are represented here by the editor of the project, Anya. Thank you. I knew I was going to say that wrong. All right. And second place in the small media category is awarded to Maria Delaney of Noteworthy, based in Ireland, for her Lift Out series, which examined transit challenges for users of the Dublin transit system. And the third place winner is Jennifer Jordan of Unabridged Press and All Abilities Media for a podcast called A Valid Podcast Season 3 that explores social inclusion for those with intellectual disabilities. In the student category, first place goes to Michael Garcia, who's here. Michael, raise your hand. Who was a graduate student, recently graduated from Syracuse University, and his piece was The Wilderness Pill, about an upstate, about the value of outdoor education for veterans with PTSD and other ailments. The second place winner in the student category is Christopher Hippensteel, also of Syracuse University, whose story, Pennsylvania Justice System Fails Autistic People, was published by Public Source. And the third place prize goes to Cronkite's own Emily Schmidt, who's here, Emily Wave, for Fading Inside, One Family's Battle with Alzheimer's Amid the Pandemic, a really poignant and personal story about health struggles in her own family that was published by Cronkite News, Arizona PBS. Congratulations to all of these winners for their amazing work, and I will now turn it over to Jennifer LaFleur for, I'm sure will be an interesting discussion about coverage of disabilities. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristen, and Thank you for asking me to do this, and congratulations to everybody again. I'm going to start with Sonja.
Cool.
So get ready. I know you can talk because we had great discussions earlier today. I want to just have you tell us the story of how you got on this story and how the idea came about for this story.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And I can talk. It's true. I got an email from the USC Annenberg School of Journalism. They support a couple of fellowships, including health reporting fellowships, including the California Health Reporting Fellowship. And because I'm disabled, and because people know that about me, they asked if I would consider pitching a disability story. And they mentioned that there was a little bit extra money. So this is is that me? Sorry. This is a fellowship that comes with some financial support for a large project, and they asked if, they said there's a little extra money if your story concerns either children 0 to 5 or, like pregnant people, I guess. And that was kind of the thought. And I was at the time reporting on education, and so my kind of first instinct was like, is there a 0 to 5 story, like a young kid story I can do? But the pregnant thing kind of stuck in my mind, and I didn't know it at the time, but I was also pregnant again at that moment. I, was going to find out soon, but it was kind of stuck in my mind, and I thought back to my own experience being disabled and pregnant, and I thought, maybe there's something here. Let me try to Google, right? Let me see what's been written about this. I'm sure you all have that experience, right? That's the first step a lot of us take. And there was nothing. And not only was there nothing, those search terms, you almost couldn't put them together and find anything that had to do with disabled parents or pregnancy as a disabled person at all. All of it was for parents of disabled children. And so that kind of clued me in. I'm like, I think this is something here, right? Especially, again, going back to my own experience.
Great, thanks. And can you talk a little bit about what some of the biggest challenges were to doing this story?
Yeah, one of the biggest challenges is that there is no data. So when I pitched it, I was like, and we're going to find this data, and we're going to use these sources, and they don't exist. The state of California has pretty significant data about, for example, disabled women's contraceptive use, and they have no data at all about birth outcomes, right? So there are some researchers, there is now some federal money to kind of get some of this data, but all of it is kind of done around the back end. It's not collected as such. It's people going through medical records and trying to systematically identify who is disabled and what outcomes they're experiencing. And what that research has revealed is really damning of the medical system.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to come back to you, but I'm going to go over to Katie. Do we have Katie on live feed? Katie Baker? Okay, well, we'll skip that for now, and we'll come back to Katie, hopefully, from BuzzFeed. And I am going to move on to Anya. So, again, can you tell us, this was an incident that happened a few years prior to this story. So can you tell me why your newsroom decided to write about it?
Yeah, so our story, is this on? Can y'all hear me? Okay. As most of you probably know, our business tends to be covering the thing that is happening at the time, or the thing that's the big story at the time. And in Lebanon, there's a lot of stories like that. So what we wanted to do was take a look at something that had happened, in this case, a year earlier, and say, okay, well, where are the people now? And what about the people who have had lasting consequences from this, horrible event? Should I fill in for people what happened? One of the biggest non-nuclear explosions in history, right very close to a civilian area, and so many people were killed, and we did lots of good reporting on that too. But we decided to look at the people who had been injured because there hadn't been a lot of coverage of them, and what there was had been very much sort of focusing on them as victims, and not quite like, oh, they've overcome this terrible thing, but yeah, focusing on mostly their victimhood. And we wanted to say, well, these are people who are actively having to fight for their rights for the medical care that the government had promised them after the accident. And so what has the past year been like for them of basically having to become advocates for their own health care?
Were there any big surprises for you that during the reporting that came to light?
I mean, no.
Thank you.
We knew it was going to be awful, and it was. I think the surprises in terms of how bad it was, I think. Surprises, like I consistently found myself outraged. We divided the work, so I'm the editor, and the reporters are all in Beirut, but I'm in New York, so I tend to take a lot of the background. And also electricity is very difficult in Beirut. Like it's very intermittent, and places at some point people get only 1 or 2 hours a day. So I would do a lot of intense backgrounding, and I found myself consistently surprised by how terrible the laws were. And the thing that really shocked me the most was we focus on this woman who lost one eye in the blast, and legally, according to Lebanon's legal definition, but also to the WHO, not disabled. I was surprised by that.
Yeah, that surprised me too. We do have Katie now. Hi, Katie.
Hi. I'm sorry. I don't know if you can hear me.
Oh, no worries. Glad you're here. I had a few. I'm Jennifer LaFleur. I'm sort of trying to ask questions tonight and hopefully get our discussion going. But I wanted to ask you about, so the Free Britney movement was happening. Your story talks about, beyond Britney. Obviously, this is an issue that many families have to deal with. But can you tell me a little bit about what prompted you to do this reporting?
Yeah, of course. I hope you can you hear me okay?
Yep, perfectly.
Oh, good. So, I think that my colleague Heidi and I, like lots of people, were really horrified by what Britney Spears was going through, that someone so famous and so wealthy was not allowed to choose how she spent her money, who she married, whether she could have children, where she lived. And we just thought, well, if this is what Britney Spears is going through, what about all the other people that are under guardianship and conservatorship? And, we just assumed that if Britney Spears can't escape her guardianship, or which, she did eventually, but it took years, we really wanted to shed light on the experiences of people who aren't famous pop stars.
So one thing that surprised me is this happens with families with lots of money, and but I was surprised that low income families also face this. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, there's different types of guardianships. There's for-profit guardianships where people go after, where professionals go after people who have large trust funds, and whether it's because they were in an accident or they were wealthy or however else, and if they're doing it for financial gain, if not in the majority of cases, but in the cases that we exposed in our story. But there's also just cases of neglect and mismanagement where there is a public administrator. It varies state by state how it works, but for people who don't have other options, they often get swept up into the system, and it's not for profit, but that doesn't mean that the same sorts of abuses are not happening.
Okay. And I know you're no longer with BuzzFeed, as so many people are no longer with BuzzFeed, but can you talk a little bit about whether this piece had any impact and what that was?
Yeah, I mean, we just heard from so many people all over the country about their own experiences, and it's hard to say whether there was a lot of attention that Britney Spears brought to the issue as well, but there has been legislation introduced at the national and statewide level following our story, and there are a lot of initiatives in different states to help kind of reform the system. But something that we heard a lot from experts and from people who have been under guardianship is that it's also about just changing public perception of people with disabilities, and there's states that have great laws where judges are supposed to only put people under guardianship in cases of last resort, and that's just not happening. So there's a lot more work to do, I think, in terms of changing public perception and opinion, not just the law, unfortunately.
Thank you. Okay, I may come back to you, so stay tuned. I just want to make sure everyone gets a chance, gets a first round here. Michael Garcia from Syracuse, tell us a little bit about how you got started on this story about the wilderness programs for PTSD.
So during my undergrad, like 2019, I was going to Texas State University, and I found this story of these veterans that were using the river there to fish, and that sort of led somewhere, but that sort of gave me this idea of veterans using outdoor spaces. And so fast forward to 2021, we were at Newhouse in Syracuse University. We were trying to build this publication, and the focus was the outdoors and how people use outdoor spaces during the pandemic. I was actually the managing editor for the publication. And so, I had this idea. Well, I said, let me, Google and see if there's anything there. And I found a bill that had been passed in New York State called the Outdoor RX Act, where there was a board that was surveying green spaces and their accessibility to veterans. And so that just, made me sort of pursue that.
So working on this story when you were a student, and you are now a professional journalist now that you've graduated, are you able to take some of the stuff you learned from that experience and apply it to your reporting now?
Oh yeah, most definitely. I actually recently did a story on a blind water skier, and sort of how he uses his platform to show other people who may be visually impaired sort of avenues that they can take in regards to maybe they want to do competitive sports. And so the stuff that I was learning, or the stuff that I learned while doing that story, I felt like I was approaching that story the same as I did with the veterans dealing with PTSD.
Great, thank you. Emily, your story was very personal about your grandmother's Alzheimer's diagnosis. Could you talk a little bit about how, whether or not your family was willing to let you kind of take something that was a very personal family thing and make it a story, and how you worked with your family to figure that out?
Yeah, absolutely. The first person I asked was my mom, because she is a person closest to my grandmother that visits her weekly, and she was pretty much the person I asked for permission, as well as my grandmother's other children, my uncles. But everyone was so supportive of telling her story, because they knew that if she had the capability to express her support for this, she would have. And I know she wanted to be a Broadway star, so her being able to gain a little bit of stardom would have been a dream for her.
So did you, through that experience telling this very personal narrative, what things did you learn that you can then bring into your future reporting?
Yeah, I primarily learned that reporting can be very emotionally intensive. But those stories that really kind of push you to tell it in the best possible way are the ones that turn out the best. And being a data journalist now for the last year, I've kind of realized that those narrative stories combined with data to provide a broader scope for the issues that are covering are the most powerful combination of stories. And I think having that narrative drive is one that I hope to incorporate in future stories.
And that's a rare combination of skills, so be proud of yourself. Sonja, I was going to come back to you on that. You had a personal connection to your story as well, but you guys handled it a little bit differently. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So like I said, I was pregnant at the time. I figured out that I was pregnant. But I had been pregnant before. I had an older child. And when I was first pregnant with my older son, I waltzed into an obstetrician's office like you do. And I was very shocked when the doctor looked at me and looked at my chart and said, "I'm sorry, you need to leave." Not congratulations, not how far along do you think you are, not when is your last menstrual period. You are a liability, we cannot see you, that is the door, goodbye. And that was kind of the anchor that I used to convince my editor that something's here, right? And it also guided me through a lot of my reporting when I was sitting down talking to other women and other mothers about these things that are very intimate and very difficult to talk about. I think I got off your question, I'm sorry. But I was sitting there visibly pregnant, having pizza with one mom who had had a very difficult delivery, and another who was struggling really hard to get pregnant. And we were able to talk about to a depth and with a degree of humor and kind of agency that I think is not always the way that reporters approach stories about disability. It's so very often about the grievous harms that are being done to disabled people, and it's not always foregrounding the creativity and the resilience with which disabled people face those harms and defeat them.
Thank you. And I was wondering, are the rest of the folks from the public source going to be able to come in or not? Okay.
It's 3 a.m.
You're on your own now. Okay. I thought I had heard that they might be able to. One thing we were talking about, Anya, earlier was, one thing we look for is impact, but you talked about how hard it is to have any impact in this kind of story in Lebanon. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's unfortunate. One of the things that you always hope, and especially when you're talking to people who also your sources hope, that telling their story will make a difference. And I think, honestly, one of the hardest parts of our job is, sometimes you just have to tamp down those hopes and say, look, I can't guarantee that anything will happen. And that's especially true in a country like Lebanon, where there just isn't a lot of accountability. It's sort of putting it mildly. The impact that you hope for, you're not going to change the law. You're not going to get someone who's done something bad. You're not going to get them removed. But the impact that you do hope for is that you will also sometimes, especially in a lot of the kind of reporting that we do at the public source, you're just letting people know that you're there and you hear their story and you hear them and you're listening and you believe them. And sometimes that is why we do stories. And sometimes that is just the best you can hope for, unfortunately.
Great, thank you. So we do have quite a few. I'm going to go to questions soon, but I wanted to ask you all, for the students here and other people who may be online, what would be your best piece of advice for someone who wants to start covering disabilities? And any of you can jump in. Otherwise, I'm going to sing.
Let people decide for themselves. At the public source, there's this whole debate, do you use people first language, people with disabilities, or do you use disability first language, you say disabled people? And lots of people have really strong feelings one way or the other, and so we just decided, well, we'll just ask the people that we're profiling and writing about, and each person can have their own designation. And it was great, and we got really cool answers, actually. And yeah, that's my biggest piece of advice.
I love that they did that, and it's at the top of the story, and I'm totally stealing that for our newsroom. So,
Good.
So appreciate that. How about the rest of you?
I'll just go like this. I would kind of piggyback off what you said, and don't be so pious. I think that like we're funny. We're, as disabled people, like we're funny. We're interesting. We have our own creative ways of doing things. We have our own ways of understanding ourselves and our situation. Don't assume that if you're able to, don't assume that your perspective on what disability is our perspective on what it is. And I think that's especially important when you're talking about questions. I find that non-disabled people can be very shy of certain things that I, as a disabled person, don't feel shy about. And conversely, there are certain things that I or my sources feel is private. And I'll give you an example. One of my sources, my main subject, didn't want to share her diagnosis. She didn't want her particular diagnosis printed. And my editor couldn't understand that, but I understand it because I think there is an abled way of looking at it that, the diagnosis explains. But for a lot of diagnoses, it really doesn't give you any more information, but it maybe holds some private information for me that I don't want to share for whatever reason. And so I think kind of that double balance.
Thank you.
I would just say too, it's very important work, to shine a light, to give an example on my story. There's this rhetoric of people that are in support of the military, and there may be just some, communication that's not being had, because there was a lot of programs, a lot of department or program heads that I spoke to that had mentioned, we have a lot of vocal support, for this specific program, but the funding isn't there. So the biggest thing is, it's important work to highlight that, maybe somewhere out there someone's reading that and is trying to make moves in legislation or anything like that. So, yeah.
Thanks. Emily?
I guess in my case, for people who have disabilities that can't necessarily advocate for themselves or communicate, I think it's equally important to both speak with and spend time with the people that care for them on a daily basis, the family, the guardians, as well as the people themselves, because those are the people you're writing about, even if they can't necessarily speak to you. It's important to let them know that you're there for them as well as their family.
And there's been some criticism of projects of late that have not included the disabled person. It's been around the disabled person, so I think that speaks to that really well. So can we ask Katie the same question, or, okay.
Hi. I want to just echo what everyone else said. Those are all really good points. And I would say in my case, being creative about how you communicate with people was really important for me, because I was speaking with people who didn't always have access because they were under guardianship. They often wanted to talk, but I couldn't just, knock on their door or call them up. So it was a lot of Facebook messaging and texting and kind of being creative about other ways to reach them. That is very specific to my story probably, but that was something that I definitely did a lot more of than I usually do in my reporting.
Can I add one thing? I think that's spot on. Actually, anytime I'm doing a story, anything around disability, I always ask in my, first introduction with someone, what is the most accessible way for us to talk? right? What is most accessible for you? And a lot of people, not just like people, it's really important with people who are, for example, like deaf or hard of hearing, but it's also really important. Some people have processing issues and they would prefer to get your questions in advance. Other people want to do video. There's lots of different reasons. That question really opens a lot of doors.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to get to some more questions in a minute, but I wanted to ask each of you if there's one thing you really want people to know about this particular story that you worked on, what would it be? Like if there's one nugget from your story you really want to share that I didn't ask you about, now's the time. Katie, did you hear the question?
Yeah,
Okay.
sure. I'll go first. I would say that something that I wish I had gotten to report more on in my story, which was really important to me, was forced sterilization. I was really shocked at how many stories I came across of this, and I've heard since I've been contacted by people who really want to do more advocacy around this issue, but because of post jobs with Roe v. Wade, people are more interested in talking about abortion, which is obviously also very important. But I think forced sterilization, which in my reporting happens far more often to people with disabilities than I definitely knew was still happening today. It's part of that spectrum of reproductive justice and health, to prevent people from having children who want to have children. And I just think that there's been a lot of good reporting on this, but I just think that there should be more. And we touched upon this a little bit in our reporting, but I just that those stories really haunted me, and I would like to see them get more attention.
Great, thank you.
So I reached out to our team before I came here, and we kind of checked back in with all the people that we talked to for the story. And our story was structured kind of as a series of almost profiles. We sort of go back and forth between people's individual stories. And unfortunately, we found out that one of them had passed away as a result of not having health care and of not being, the government just wouldn't pay for his health care, and he was very poor. Lebanon system, it's very sort of laissez-faire capitalist system. And if you're poor and you can't afford private health care, you're kind of at the mercy of the government, which isn't very good at providing services. And yeah, just if there's one takeaway from that, it's when people don't have health care, they die when they don't have to.
Thank you.
I want to piggyback on what Katie said. She's 100% right. I said this to the group, but I am very skeptical in general of the idea of raising awareness and that being a goal. But in this story, it was a significant goal because part of so many of the harms we were seeing stemmed from doctors and the public in general not believing that disabled people can get pregnant, do have sex, want to get pregnant, and that belief comes directly from the same thing that Katie's talking about with forced sterilization. There's a great deal of discomfort about the idea that disabled people might make disabled children. There's a lot of discomfort with disabled sexuality, and there's a real lot of eugenics that is still happening today, and that has real world consequences. It's not just a one person's disgust feeling that they privately have, that's a policy. So yeah.
Thank you.
I would say, probably want to bring more awareness to these outdoor programs. The Houston Chronicle recently did a story that Texas actually has the highest suicide rate among veterans in comparison to the United States. So it's probably something to look up to see if there's any other programs out there that veterans can use, even green spaces, accessibility in these green spaces for veterans, because it's just recently, I think in 2019, you know, that people in the medical community are looking at these programs as something that can be prescribed, you know, and this is something that's been utilized in like feudal Japan. Samurais would go fishing in order after combat. So it'd be interesting if there's sort of a push in Texas, you know, since we're like the second highest population of veterans next to California, I believe. So.
Great, thank you. Emily?
Yeah, I think I would have loved to have been able to rope in a few of the women that my grandmother spent most of her time with in memory care, who were a lot more lucid and aware than she was, but because they legally cannot speak for themselves and make decisions without speaking to whoever put them in memory care, I couldn't talk with them, which I think was a disservice to the story because they were the ones who cared so much for my grandmother. And I think that's just one of the hurdles of covering any sort of senior living centers or memory care.
Okay, I'm going to open it up to the audience. We're getting online questions too, correct? Okay, okay. So, yeah, feel free to ask questions. Or I will ask some more. But don't be shy. I'm sure you have better questions than I do. So,
Do it.
yeah, is there anything you guys want to learn from the reporters?
You should ask us questions or we'll start asking you questions.
Yeah.
I see you getting up. I see you.
Okay. Well, please move towards the microphone if you want to ask a question. And we'll continue up here until then, but I will look for your movement towards the microphone. Oh,
Yeah,
Kristen.
Sorry, I do have a question. You raised the issue of the diagnosis. How did you handle that in your story? Did you end up giving her medical diagnosis, or did you describe her condition?
No, I described
in some
it.
way?
I'll describe it and I'll tell you exactly why. Thank you for that. I have a diagnosis that a lot of anti-vax, like the kind of current anti-vax freak out, latched onto mine as though it was exploding with people taking the COVID vaccine. And so, A, if I say it right now, you're not going to know it. It's not going to give you any additional information. But B, it is going to bring a lot of people in who are going to attach to that and say, well, was it the vaccine that you got? And so that's why, and it's what she wanted. So we just described it.
Great. So one thing I will say is, since we've been doing this contest with NCDJ, there's so many more stories about disability and from all over the world. We get a huge number of international entries, and things are not great here for people with disabilities, but the stories about conditions in Africa especially are amazing, the type of reporting that they're able to do. So the contest is getting some amazing entries, and we're learning about disability coverage all over the world, and the fact that many places people have no rights, or everyone is not covered by those rights or given the benefits that they need, as they are here as well. So it's been pretty interesting to watch this contest grow. I got into this because I did some disability reporting early in my career, and it's the best thing I ever did. And there's so many important stories that are centered around policies and systems that, unless we're doing these stories, are not going to change. So that's my little spiel about that. what is the best advice? Well, we already did that. Sorry, I'm going to ask another question. I just kind of want to chat with these guys because they have such great stories. What was the biggest surprise in your stories for you that you didn't think you would find?
I keep coming back to the eye thing. That kind of blew my mind. I guess I tend to be a policy person, so I like to kind of geek out on what's the legal framework, and I'm one of those kind of reporters where I would have the entire story would just be, how the law was passed, and like things like that. And obviously, the story is about what is the impact of that on people's lives, but that path from the law to this person literally is not getting health care, cannot do their job, in one case dies. That's always like the part that, to me, that you're just always very shocked at sort of how that path can be can be very complicated, but sometimes actually very straightforward. So in the case of Lebanon, the government basically just lied and said we're going to cover everyone's health care, and then they just didn't. But the way that they did that was that they sort of passed a series of laws where at first they were like, decree that we're going to pay for everyone's health care who was disabled by the blast. And then there was a second law that was, we're going to cover them under this thing. And it's like, well, but that doesn't really make sense. And so for me, I know this sounds very boring. A lot of the kind of reporting, a lot of policy reporting is really boring, but the boringness contains the stuff that's dramatic, like the boringness, like we're going to pass this really boring law that no one's going to pay attention to, but it's going to directly affect like life or death things that will determine whether you get health care or not. So I don't know if that's surprising, but I wasn't expecting that to sort of, people's fate to hinge on this like extremely dorky difference between one definition and another, or like, are you covered under this thing or that thing?
But also good advice to like really dig in and understand the system, not just, it's not just about talking to individuals, but really understanding systematic problems. I remember I was working on some transit disability stories 1,000 years ago, the early transit systems, and the head of the Civil Rights Office at the Transportation Department said, read this, and then talk to me. And so my reporting partner and I did. We read every single document he gave us, did our homework, went back to him, and he said, you're the first people that ever actually did this. So he gave us everything we needed. So do your homework. That's my advice. So yeah. How about the rest of you?
I feel like I could name a few. I mean, some of the statistics, some of the stuff I found out, like, for example, a blind woman is twice as likely as a sighted woman to get a C-section. Like, that doesn't make any sense. So that was very shocking, right? Those kind of things that were in the data, such as it was. But I think one of the, it wasn't a personal surprise to me, but it was a surprise how much I heard it. I was talking to a lot of parents who had genetic disabilities, right? Things that they could pass, and were actually very excited to have children who share their disabilities. And these are disabilities in many cases that non-disabled parents, if they're detected, will terminate the pregnancy, right? And not in any way to cast judgment on that, but it was very difficult for these parents to explain to the physicians that they were seeing, like, I don't want you to frame this to me as a problem, because for me, it's actually a point of pride, right? That I'm going to have a child with dwarfism. That's what my husband and I have, and we're very excited for that. So, yeah.
So the problem was how the health system was dealing with them, not...
Yeah, and having to be really a fierce advocate and kind of know what was going to happen ahead of time and really be very clear with the doctor and very forceful, like, I'm really happy about this. Please don't frame it a different way to me.
So are you, I mean, you work for a major news outlet. Do you know of greater awareness now in that community because of your reporting?
I mean, it was more of a slow burn. I know that there is now kind of a fairly recent push to actually get more of this data formally collected. One of my subjects is now working with Alice Wong with Disability Visibility on a piece for her forthcoming anthology. Like there's kind of like, I got a lot of notes from people who felt very seen by it or who shared it, doctors who were sharing it and found it very useful, so.
Great.
There was a couple of things. The first thing was sort of the impact that outdoors has on your mental health. With the passing of these two bills, I was told by a professor from Cornell, this is a signal that, these programs are close to being prescribed, and just the idea, that someone can be prescribed this and it can have a positive effect. I thought that was pretty interesting. The second thing was, I don't really see it too much covered, but was sort of the programs that that are for veterans who have been sexually assaulted in the military, mainly women, and sort of the programs out there to help them with their PTSD. So that was also sort of a eye-opening thing, because you hardly ever hear, one, about these programs, and two, you hardly ever hear any stories about sexual assault in the military. So.
This may not be the case when we ask you this anyhow. There's been a lot of pushback about wilderness programs to treat young people. And did you run into that in any of your reporting where there was criticism of, all wilderness programs because of what might have happened in programs for youth?
I didn't run into anything like that, no. I'm trying to...
It's okay. It's okay that you didn't run into it. I was just curious, because I know that's been an issue. Is Katie still there?
Yeah. Hi.
She just magically appears.
I was listening to everyone, and I've just like, what was most surprising? Was that the question?
Yep. What was the big surprise for you?
Yeah, I was going to try and come up with a good answer, and I was listening to everybody. I really just think the scope of how vast the guardianship system is. It's estimated to be more than 1 million people, and it just, I, as an investigative reporter, I'm pretty jaded. I'm used to hearing really awful stories about people being put through really bad things, but I just, Heidi and I, when we were reporting this, just every time we talked to someone or read another document, we were just kind of blown away by the freedoms that were taken away from the people that we were reporting on, and that this was so prevalent, and that really until Britney Spears, there had been some reporting on it, definitely, and I don't want to downplay the really important work that's been done around this issue, but I find it very frustrating that it took Britney Spears to get more attention paid to it, and I still feel like, now she's out, but I wonder whether the interest in legislation and collecting data, I think like Sonja said, there's just no data on this issue at all. We don't actually know how many people are under guardianship in America, and Senator Elizabeth Warren, was behind some initiatives to get more data on this, and I do just hope that I wonder if we'll ever get that information. We know how many people are in prison in the U.S. We should know how many people are under guardianship, because more rights are taken away from you than when you go to prison. So yeah, I think that just kind of the general scope of how the system works.
That's amazing. So there was a film a few years ago called, I think it's We Care a Lot, that was horrific. It was a very, very dark comedy about what happens in guardianships. After reading your story, it kind of made it seem like that was a documentary. Because stuff like that really happens, right?
That story was definitely, I watched that movie, it was definitely based on one guardian in particular who, I won't name because I think the criminal case is still pending against her. But the thing that frustrated me about that movie, I don't know if everyone's seen it, is that they had to kind of create this weird like mafia plot in addition to the guardianship. Like it got kind of fantastical, and I was just like, guys, like this is enough. Like the way that this works is enough for a movie. You don't have to kind of introduce fantasy into it, because I thought the parts about how the system works were very very accurate and very on point. And then I was just kind of mad that they made it a bit ridiculous with the like mob side plot. But that's neither. It's kind of a tangent.
Great, thank you. Okay, who is going to get asked a question and get an automatic A in all classes? I'm just kidding. I have no power, but.
Can I? Oh,
Can I ask it from here?
sure.
So all of your stories were pretty like sad or personal. What was like a personal impact after covering the story? Do you want to repeat?
I'll repeat the question for the virtual people. So many of the stories were sad and difficult stories. And how do you all deal with that? How did you feel after doing the story? Did I get that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Actually, that's such a good question. We just found out about the guy who passed away, and we were all pretty upset. We talk a lot about secondary trauma at the Public Source because a lot of the stuff that we write about is pretty dark. And, there's a lot of advice for how to deal with sad or bad things in our profession, but it's, for the people in Beirut, for the team in Beirut, like they're also living these things too. One of our co-founders actually had a family member pass away as a result of the blast, and it's especially hard, I think, when you're in it and you're reporting on it. And I don't know, I do a lot of like, are you okay? Like, do you want to talk about this? Do you want to not talk about this? I guess I check in a lot. I mean, it's part of my job as editor. I think some of us were talking about how the news profession is changing. It used to, when I was coming up, when I was a kid, it was like a very macho ethos that you should never show any emotion, and you should never say like, hey, I'm really upset about the person I talked to today, and you sort of have to keep a stiff upper lip, and that's not good. And I think there's also an ethos that you shouldn't show emotion during interviews. There's actually, sometimes that's true, because you don't want to make it about yourself, but there's also a way to do it where you're a human being. And so we do a lot of kind of checking in with each other, like how do you feel about this? Are you okay? One of our reporters the other day was like, I'm just going to wipe this story from my brain for 3 days and then go back to it. And I forgot, I don't know if I answered your question exactly, but we're kind of making it up as we go along, but frequently checking in and kind of monitoring each other and monitoring yourself is key.
Thank you. That's all we have time for, but we'll be around here for a little bit. And Kristen, any closing remarks? Thank you all for being here. Congratulations again to everybody, your amazing work. And thanks
give them
to
all a
those
hand
online.
for their amazing work. Thanks, and we'll do trophies and pictures. And if you have questions, like more questions, just go up and have a conversation. Take some pictures.